lot of folks said they were interested in kind of discussing some articles, movies, and books. So kind of to initiate that, we pulled out two articles from the Harvard Business Review that talk about performance evaluations, just to kick this discover and discuss with Wild off today. So oh yeah. Oh.
I started the recording, Natalie, just so you know.
And so maybe we can touch base on, well, I'm just curious, if maybe with a raise of hands, who had a time to take a quick look at the articles. Okay, cool. So it's kind of half-half, so I'll kind of take a quick overview of what they covered, and then we can kind of go into questions. So kind of the big gist of it is a gender bias in performance reviews, and kind of what the issues are and some suggestions about what to do about it. Perhaps some of you have experienced this yourself. But the basic flaw is that women, for the most part, seem to be shortchanged in reviews. And part of it is kind of the use of language in reviews that they have shown, based on a few studies, to be not constructive feedback and more vague descriptions of what someone had done, and not in response to specific projects or work that someone worked on. So that's really the problem, that the evaluations are really subjective and thus open to bias. So we invite you to kind of share your experience, and we have a couple of questions that we kind of have out for everyone. So one, how can we request performance reviews to be a little bit more specific? And, you know, I've had this problem myself where I asked for a performance review and my boss said, things are going fine. Okay, fine is great. But something more, you know, like which projects have I done well on? What did you like? Or, you know, perhaps where do you see areas for improvement? So I'm gonna open up the floor to anyone who would like to jump in on that.
Natalie, I'll start. So I agree with you. I've had similar, I've had a couple of managers over the years, and I have had a similar experience as you, where sometimes you have to go out and solicit, especially in my opinion, maybe smaller companies that are maybe a little less formal as far as like giving performance due dates. It seems to me, in my experience, that the larger companies are a little bit more formal about having annual reviews. People on here might think differently. But at least in the smaller companies, I'd be soliciting some feedback and, you know, oh, you're doing fine, everything's great, I've, you know, nothing to say. And I'd specifically say, you know, I appreciate any kind of constructive criticism that you have, because that's how it makes you a better person. So I'm actually interested to hear from other people, you know, because I feel like I have said, you know, please tell me the good, the bad, the ugly, just so that, you know, you have an opportunity to improve yourself. And I've had difficulty, at least in the smaller companies, soliciting that information or getting that information back to me. In my opinion, the larger companies seem to have formal questionnaires that they filled out, and, you know, and kind of checked the boxes and went down the line and that. So I would love to hear from somebody else to see if they've had a similar experience as well, or if they have a different experience. Because I don't know how to ask for more. I mean, unless you actually come to the table with a list of specific questions, like what did you feel about project A? What did you feel about how I handled this team member? I don't know how to get more specific information. Does anybody else have any thoughts?
I mean, I've had a requirement from previous employers to come up with a list of questions for them. So it wasn't just about them commenting about me. And yes, in larger firms, they do tend to have the list of kind of standard questions to make sure that they're covering a wide variety of both technical and personality and money issues, and sort of a wide range of topics that you may be stronger or less strong in. But there was definitely a request to have a list of questions back for them, things that maybe I didn't feel that they were being as responsive as needed, areas that it would be helpful if they did X or Y during the design process or during CA. So
you actually had the opportunity to critique them in addition to it going the other way.
It wasn't exactly critiquing. It was more like asking them, it would often start out by, I don't really understand how this part of the business works. Maybe, in a larger firm, you may be kept out of specific sections of the business because they've decided that each one of the jobs should just stick to a very specific set of items that they should be in charge of, and they shouldn't really get involved with other parts. And so I felt that the questioning part of it was often a way of, okay, I've been here for a while, but I have no idea how you're handling proposals, or I have no idea how you're really doing billing, or I don't, I've been here a certain while and I don't understand how you think about design, because there's some principles that don't really talk about their thought process on design, their approach to it. And if it's a bigger firm, you may not be around them enough, or even if you are, maybe they just think very differently. My previous employers had a very different thought process on design. It was really, really different from mine. So that was actually a topic of conversation for a few years of, how do you think about it? And what is your process? How do you get to the point where you're making these specific suggestions that my thought processes don't lend me to go that direction? So it was a lot more back and forth, and that process helped us to understand each other better.
That's good. That's useful. Thank you.
Another thing that as a boss, I find helpful with evaluations is to ask an employee to provide their own self-evaluation. So, you could ask, if you're about to go into an evaluation or you're asked to schedule, a review, whatever you want to call it, you might suggest, do you have some format you'd like me to evaluate myself and tell you how I think I'm doing, or what my issues are, or where I think I might need more help. And also it kind of answers that thing, Natalia, that you're saying about how do you kind of kickstart if you feel like you haven't had a review in a long time. You can go up to the employer and say, I'm really interested in seeing how you think I'm doing, and I'd like to tell you how I think I'm doing, or talk with you about that, and do your own evaluation as well. Kind of adds it makes it more two-way thing. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hi guys, it's Casey. Sorry I joined a little bit late. But yeah, I definitely think that evaluations and like performance reviews, whatever, are very critical. And I know, like, when I first started at firms, I would usually ask when it came, my 1 year anniversary, I would end up asking for a review, which I think it should be inherently. I think 1 year maybe isn't enough. Now with like, as our company has grown, I'm the one giving the reviews, and I make sure that we do at least a 6-month and then an end of year. So actually, like today I just gave one and I'm giving 2 tomorrow. But I agree with everything that, you know, I've heard people say so far, that it's not just an evaluation of that person. It's a conversation between how is, you know, a staff member working within the company, and it should be, I think, an open conversation on like, what are ideas that you have, or it could be so open-ended, but I think that's also a good framework, you know, so that especially if, you know, it's someone new to the firm, you know, they're not coming into an evaluation like shaking that they're just going to get criticized, but they feel like they're able to either ask questions, give suggestions, and have that kind of conversation, you know, about like how you can grow together, I think is like a good way too of phrasing it. But that, like,
So being prepared, it's not just a one-way conversation, it's a two-way.
Right. And that the person who's giving the reviews doesn't feel like they have to, like, you know, come up with, you know, an exact structure of how the meeting is going to go. And I think that's, you know, a really good way to get feedback, you know, from the people working at a company on how they feel within the company. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks for sharing. So it seems like, yeah, like a lot of, you are saying that it's really more about creating a conversation, especially if, and making it the two-way street. So, and have any of you encountered maybe considering like bringing outside feedback, say from clients as well? Because that's really ultimately not just like the work you produce, but the relationships also that you develop help support the company as well.
It helps determine whether you get future business.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
I can jump.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I was going to jump in here because I've been on the sales and sales management side. The design I've done was on my own, so I wasn't, there was no, although I'm my own worst critic. But what I've found is, you know, I work for a lighting design firm, and while it's not huge, I mean, we've over 20 people, it's enough where we have different divisions. But I thought it was really important to institute weekly meetings with everyone so that there was a more collaborative sense in the office, because it's not good to sort of, especially on the sales side, you need to know about accounting. You know, you need to know about schedules for, you know, if I'm bringing in an opportunity for design, they have to be very aware of the schedule. You know, I spent 4 years on the construction side where everything was about projects, following a project schedule. So I think that it's great when you do start, you say like you're very siloed and you don't know about different divisions. I think that that's really important, and that's helped our firm a lot to sort of have a sense of what everyone's role is, but there's also crossover. Because ultimately, I always say that we're all salespeople. If you work for a firm, you're a salesperson of that firm. You're a representative of that firm. Even if you're not interacting with the client directly, you know, you're a team member. So what I like to share, which is also great for people who are doing drafting and things like that, is I love to share positive feedback at the end of a project, like, you know, anything, you know. So a lot of times I'll request something from a client, but a lot of the sort of back office type people that are doing drafting or whatever may not interact with a client. It's great for them to see that a project was really successful and give them credit. that this client really enjoyed working with our firm.
That's nice. In fact, I'd like to ask a question by show of hands, like how many people do have like weekly meetings in their office where you're talking about projects and staffing or anything. Yeah, it looks like almost all of us do. Yeah. Okay.
I think a lot of that has also changed because of the virus, the work from home order. It wasn't something that was happening previously in my company, and it was something I had tried to institute in my company to happen at least, once a week or every other week, and it didn't really. It was very easy to kind of move that meeting because it didn't correlate with someone's schedule, so it would end up just getting delayed till it was canceled. So in a way, I think because of the pandemic, at least in my firm, there's been a real improvement in that because there is a need to talk to people and see what's happening and be updated. But what I would like to see is, once we move back to working from the office, to keep that habit, at least, some version of it.
Yeah. Mondays seem to work really well.
That's what ours is.
Yeah,
9
late
Mondays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, at our company, we, years ago, we would say, oh yeah, like we're going to have this team meeting. Yeah, we're going to have it. But then just like you said, Natalia, it kept just like pushed back and rescheduled. But for the last, I would say 2 years, we've come up where like we just have a schedule. So we have a monthly team meeting, but it's the same day, same time, once a month. We have the calendar, recurring invites so everyone can plan around it. And it's rare then that it gets rescheduled. I think that just coming up with like one day or time or, however often you need to do it, just like getting it on the calendar and everyone knows that's when it is. And I think that approach, it really helped us become more consistent.
And it also helps for reviews because everybody is current with what's going on.
And it's probably easier to see how people interact with each other a little bit more because everybody's in the same room at least once a week.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
In the same Zoom room.
Yeah.
Yeah, this works.
Would you say for people who are giving these performance reviews, I'm not at a point where I'm giving any reviews, but I'm receiving them. Has there been any change or in types of questions or in the standards of, due to COVID? Like, what has changed because of this virus in those reviews, if anything?
I've not seen a review during COVID yet.
No, I haven't either.
Probably also not really happening. Right?
I would say, if anything, maybe a little bit more forgiving.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we did one today, and that's been the only one that we've done so far. But it hasn't. Our review, it's like our 6-month review, and yes, it's different than if we were. I guess like the things that we were looking at and evaluating would have been different if this virus didn't happen. But in general, like the overall review and what we were getting out of it was pretty much the same. I guess it was good, but we also talk on a pretty often basis. So like I didn't have to go into like how are they working or how are they handling everything with COVID because I already know that. So it was more of like just the traditional things that you would talk about during a review. And also like I was asking them, if they had any ideas for like marketing or digital communication, things that everyone is trying to, develop and really, build maybe new strategies for now because of COVID, opening up that kind of conversation was something that came up.
And you know what, something we had talked about earlier that you can bring up with your employer or the person who's, potentially giving the reviews in your office is actually to bring up a request for, a review, or at least, typically we associate reviews with a request for a raise, right? But it can also, I think it's also important to just even have that feedback, like, yes, am I doing well? and in what areas can I improve, and specifically how. And within that, you can also provide some, feedback or questions to your employer. So I don't see, even though maybe it's not a great economic climate, there's no reason to not get some response back to how you're working and functioning within the team. I think that's a pretty important thing as well.
I agree with you. And I can say, at least from personal experience, when I first started out working, I was probably a little bit more timid in asking for specific feedback about myself. Like, it was more of a one-way conversation. But as I've gotten older and, I've worked for a couple different people, it's been a lot easier for me personally to try and have that two-way conversation, because when you're maybe a little bit older, a little more experienced, you feel like you have more to contribute. You've already have base knowledge. And so it's easy to say, okay, well, I know I can do A, B, and C. So, but I could use some help with D. Whereas maybe on day one, you're like, I need help with A, B, C, and D. So.
I get a little nerdy. I've always, for reviews, brought like a notepad with like questions that I had and comments that I had for myself, but also for the firm and, the people in charge or leading the office. Because I know I used to like definitely get nervous. So, everything would disappear from my head.
Mm-hmm.
So writing things in advance really helps to, one, articulate what you're really concerned or thinking about, but also just to remind you when you're in that meeting. Yeah.
Has anybody had any experience with like doing, I know like 360 was popular, I think like in the 90s or maybe the early 2000s, where you would get feedback from coworkers, managers, administrative, or has anybody ever had any type of review other than the typical manager to employee standard?
No. So I would be interested in the 360 to see what other people, not just the manager, perceive.
But as managers, because there's only been one time in my life where I've actually had people that reported to me, but as anybody who's out here as a manager, is it typical, or do you go out of your way to try and solicit opinions from other people? Like, hey, how does Kim work in a team meeting if you don't have that personal knowledge? Or have you heard her talk on the phone with clients? Or have you seen her give a presentation? Like, has anybody solicited feedback like that from other team members, or is it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had good experiences before I got to that position, where my boss at the time was definitely going around the office and asking about me. So I knew while I was getting my review with him, he was telling me feedback that he had gotten from, other managers in the office, and how that could, either support some of my good habits or inform things that I should be changing. And then when I was, started working more as a manager, I was definitely going around and asking, but my last employer would definitely come to me regularly before other designers' reviews and say, let me know, write an email or sit down with me for 10-15 minutes and tell me what your experiences are with this designer in the office. So there was definitely a collating of information. It really wasn't just the owner of the company or whoever the person is that was doing the yearly review. It wasn't just their opinion. There was definitely, a grouping of information before that started.
Yeah, I think that's important. I remember one time when I was on a team, I think the way that people present themselves in front of managers can be different than with team members. And I remember this one time, my manager came to me and he's like, hey, if I end up moving up in the company, there's a chance that Jim would end up taking my spot, or, you know, if I get hit by a bus, you know, maybe Jim would take my spot. And I was like, oh my God, please don't get hit by a bus. I don't want to work for Jim. And so like, that was just like, to have the opportunity to say something like that, I think was valuable as an employee, to have a little bit of control and, you know, back it up with specific reasons why, not just, you know, like, hey, you know, he handpicks his projects, he's not a team player, like whatever those reasons are, you know, but to have the opportunity to say it is, I think it's valuable. And it's valuable as an employee to hear those things later and say like, okay, I guess the way I'm presenting myself to my peers maybe isn't the way I should be. So that's great.
Can I share the craziest performance review I've ever had?
Yeah.
I had somebody get out of his seat and have me sit in his seat, and he sat opposite and said, okay, now give your review as if you're me.
Which you do. Nora's
I did it.
the best
I
employee
did.
ever.
Well, the first thing I quoted was something that a friend told me a priest had said to him years ago, which is never participate in your own persecution. So you want to say as many good things as you can. But yeah, that's a true story.
So you got a glowing review is what you said.
Of course. No, I was willing. I'm always, listen, I'm good at self-criticism too. I mean, I like to have goals and to improve and all that. And I know the areas where I'm weak. I'm terrible at expense reports. But
they're just terrible.
yeah, it's an interesting tactic though, I'll tell you that.
I would argue that I'm probably harder on myself than maybe somebody else might be, like you said.
Well, that's what happens actually. And that was what was told to me.
Mm-hmm.
It seems to be a shared trait amongst a lot of people then. I'm quite hard on myself.
Women are, men aren't typically. Men will say all kinds of wonderful things about themselves all the time.
Does anybody else? Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
The big companies are all are mostly done ahead of time, where it's a formal. I've worked for Phillips, I've worked for Cooper, and it was always a very formal process. And then, so you fill out basically self-assessment, and then you meet with your manager.
Yeah.
So being your own worst critic kind of transitions to, you know, if you've ever experienced inequitable reviews, and kind of what are some things you would do differently today with what you know now?
That assumes you know the other side.
That's true. But I think inequitable can also include just feedback that isn't constructive and doesn't give a how, like just saying vague feedback, basically.
I actually have an example. So probably my least favorite job, when I was hired by the company, there was, maybe about a dozen of us in the department, and we all had very specific job responsibilities. And then for whatever reason, downsizing, blah, 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 there ended up being like 3 of us doing about 12 people's jobs. And so when it was time for my review, I was told that I wasn't really doing a very good job. And I took it personally because I thought, when I got hired, there were 12 people that were sharing this weight. And then, now we're down to 3. And you're right, there's always room for improvement. I could always do better, but you got to take a look at the big picture here. Like, it's not the same as when, this isn't what I didn't walk into this. Like, I walked into something different, and now this is what I've been given. So I was a little upset about that, what I would consider an equitable review.
And that, I think, probably a lot of us have experienced that. I know that I certainly did. I was working at a firm where there was certain amount of work that I was signing on for, and then there was less and less employees working on the caseload that I was working on, and then there were none. You know, I'd have conversations every week with my employers about this is just not workable. I can't do my best on any of this because there's too much of it. So yes, that was, and ultimately that was my reason for leaving. I was like, okay, you know, if you can't create, I mean, it wasn't even just like a work-life balance. It was just a sensible approach to, you know, how to divide work up amongst the employees you have, then this is not working. So
I think
yes, sometimes the review is about them.
I think I hear that in the industry, in certain areas, and you know, fairly frequently. So, what kind of advice would you give to those people to, in order to approach their employers or managers who aren't really where people just feel overwhelmed? I mean, I know your solution was to ultimately leave, but
I tried to make things better, and I worked very hard at that. And there were certain promises made and not kept, which was ultimately, you know, it was a negotiation trying to sort through the issues and what was going on at the time. But yeah, there was a lot of talking involved. And
Same thing. I ended up leaving. I mean, you try to come up with solutions, or you can only do so much unless you have, you know, management's buy-in. And if you can't get it, then
yep.
you wish them well and you move on.
Yes.
I guess voting with your feet.
I'm sorry?
You could call it voting with your feet.
Yeah.
Has anybody else had like a review, like either funny or insightful or anything that they'd like to share?
Yeah, you know, at one of the firms that I worked at, where there was a more full kind of checklist of things, I remember my employer's biggest gripe was that my handwriting wasn't up to par. And I thought it was really funny because I only ever wrote emails, so I don't know where the handwriting even came in.
Wow.
That's funny.
So I guess, you know, to myself, I thought, well, you know, that's the only thing they could find. Probably doing pretty well.
That's very funny.
That was a weird one.
Very strange.
Are you sure they weren't mistaking you for somebody else? Like, it's so weird.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't know.